Hello once again and welcome to Herd Immunity News. I'm Marcus Botzer. Today, I have a fascinating guest onto the show. I have Mr. Alex Thomson. He is a former officer with GCHQ, that's Governmental Communications Headquarters based in England. He's also one of the driving forces and powers behind UK Column, which I have followed for about 10 years now, and we seriously recommend that you all check out this incredible website, which is really at the forefront of the movement to expose what's going on in the world right now. But without further ado, let me just say, Alex, how are you, sir?
Thank you, Marcus. I'm all the better for talking to you, and I'm doing well. I am outside. I will apologize in advance for any background noises you hear, because that is the genuine street scene of Tbilisi, Georgia, and we're recording this at the end of a week of heavy protests in what used to be my specialist domain, the country that I worked on for GCHQ. So I'm sure we'll get into that discussion, but doing very well.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. And you really are, geographically, a fascinating position right now with all the change and upheaval and tumult that's going on. But we've mentioned in the introduction that you're a former officer with GCHQ. Could you give our viewers and listeners a little bit of background into your fields of expertise in these matters?
GCHQ recruited me as a linguist, and anyone who knows languages will immediately take umbrage at that term and say, you weren't analysing language in an academic sense. Correct, but the British have never been great at languages, and when GCHQ and some other government departments talk about a Russian linguist or whatnot, what they mean is somebody who is passively competent in those languages and can produce gists or verbatim transcripts and translations of written and spoken material intercepted by GCHQ, NSA, or the other three Five Eyes partners, DSD down under. You used to live in Australia. That's the Aussie version, and the two others, the Canadians and the New Zealanders, are in the mix. And it's a signals intelligence conglomerate of those five countries, plus increasingly close connections with most continental European countries, into something that's half of NATO these days. It all goes into a big pot, subject to various caveats, and whatever is intercepted is shared within that. And I was, as I say, recruited largely on the strength of that Georgian and Russian language ability, which I had acquired from living out here as a graduate. The first thing I did after graduating from Cambridge was come out here and help the evangelical student movement as a teacher of English and teacher of the Bible here. So that's what gave me the languages with which I was recruited. But during my 8 years there, I increasingly became an analyst and reporter and country expert as well. And then sideways moved into other fields because they have a lot of cross-disciplinary working. So I was a member of their CBRN team, which is one of the global teams, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. I'm not hopelessly cynical about the colleagues I had. They were mostly very well-intentioned, patriotic, and had their heads screwed on. But by the end of that time, I had realized that whether you're talking about what the jargon calls state threats or non-state threats, or actors you often hear, they're not really looking at the whole picture and not looking at where the threats come from. If you take a particular example of Georgia, the decade of the 2000s, most people who know anything about geopolitics will remember that decade was bookended in Georgia by the Rose Revolution in 2003, when Mikhail Saakashvili became the pro-Western president, and then in August 2008, a 5-day war with Russia over South Ossetia, a separatist part of Georgia. Neither of those big events was foreseen by me or any of the other country experts in the British or American establishment, whether it's military or civilian intelligence or diplomats that you're talking about. And afterwards, I realized that there were some people in the City of London who jolly well knew what the outcome was going to be, and they didn't bother to tell us.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many deep state operations going on right now, and they've gone on for maybe 100 years or more. There's been false flags, that there's been so many covert operations that we've done, that Russia done, China, they're constantly doing it. But what we're seeing right now is a culmination of so many programs coming at once. Now, very interestingly, you've gone back to Georgia. You're in the capital, Tbilisi, right now. What made you go over to Georgia at that point in time? What were your concerns and what are your goals from your trip?
This time, this is the second year that I've made a trip at Orthodox Easter, which is just after Western Easter. largely to keep up the friendships that I have, to keep up my fluency, and to keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on in this country and this part of the world. Some of my dearest friends remain here because it was a formative age as a 19, 20, 21-year-old that I started coming here, and that I lived here for a year. And also to see, what I can personally make of the various claims that you have in the free media, the new media, about the extent to which Russia is a beneficial actor or a brake on Western nefariousness in the region. I've become a lot more uncommitted, non-committal about that than I used to be. I don't like using this buzzword nuanced, but you get my drift. Yes. I think that oligarchy it sees no nationality. Really, it sees no currency or loyalty to anything other than itself, and that's what we're dealing with in this part of the world. And some oligarchs are aligned to the Kremlin, some to the City of London, and the pieces move around the board slowly and leave a trail of destruction in their wake. And to them, political parties and nations are much lesser things. Those are the main priorities, but also at this stage of life, and I foresaw this also when I was in my 20s as an intelligence officer and as also living here, I knew that I was going to be increasingly involved in Bible translation as I built up those skills. And I may soon actually do a podcast with Brian Gerrish, which you may find in time on ukcolumn.org, going into detail on the whys and the wherefores of Bible translation. This is one of the oldest Christian nations on the planet. It's been officially Christian since the 4th century AD, beaten basically only by Armenia. And so they have had plenty of history of the Bible in Georgian. But I'm thoroughly convinced that it is the foundation of culture and civilization and decent treatment of each other, and that it provides the only counterweight to the geopolitical machinations we see at the moment. The claims that you must be with one or other of the increasingly totalitarian blocs and ideologies that there are in the world that reach into our purchasing power and everything about us now, our family structure. So I come up here also to keep up my fluency in that, in the language, to be able to assist with those projects.
I mean, all fantastic reasons for going out there, and I'm sure a lot of people, the more information that they learn about Georgia and its significance to the Christian world, they will maybe take a trip out there themselves, which I'm sure you recommend. But there's
Georgian Dream is the majority and therefore governing party in Georgia that took off from where Mikhail Saakashvili, the Rose Revolution guy of 20 years ago, left. He effectively, in a spurt of modernization, and it's no exaggeration to say that he was a George Soros puppet. He very much was. I saw it firsthand. He, his appetites got the better of him in every sense. He was quite an unself-controlled character, and had a bunch of hotheads around him who tried to take on Russia militarily in 2008. That was with Israeli backing as well, by the way, which continues in neighboring Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has been able to perpetrate genocide on ethnic Armenians, particularly in Nagorno-Karabakh, which isn't part of Armenia proper, using Israeli military assistance. That's well known. Back then, the idea was that Israel and neoconservative warhawks in Washington, because they, of course, thought they were going to get a McCain election in 2008, they thought they were going to have a clean sweep, that there was going to be no more Russian geopolitical presence in the Caucasus, and that they needed their placemen in power. Saakashvili he proved too unstable to stay the course. He did, in a spurt of modernization, bring Georgia out of the abject poverty that I well remember here. I was just saying to a friend I was wandering around town with this afternoon, I said, do you remember when there was not a single bookshop in this city, and when everything stank, and people were selling their libraries in the streets to earn enough to eat dinner? Yes, that was completely turned around in a few years under Saakashvili. But the thugs under him, towards the end of his tenure in the mid-2010s, were making no bones about it. They were aggressive Eurofascists, I would call them. The Interior Ministry, the police, started talking about the need to rid Georgia of the dominant influence of the Orthodox Church, which is not a gathering of saints, I have to tell you, at hierarchical level. And there's been recent scandals in Georgia and other Orthodox countries about this. There's plenty of sexual perversion and drug selling and political blackmailing going on in these patriarchies, the headquarters of the various national Orthodox churches. Plenty of links back to the KGB and its successors as well. But be that as it may, you are stabbing the Georgian nation in its heart if you try to remove the central role of Christianity. and the constitutional recognition that it has. The same in other former Soviet countries. I've just interviewed Yuri Roshka of Moldova, and that will be on ukcolumn.org for those who want to find that. Similar dynamics. Saakashvili then, and I'm sorry that this takes a while, but it is part of the world you have to treat properly to understand.
Sure.
Saakashvili fell to disgrace, became stateless. He's now in prison, was on hunger strike actually for a while back in Georgia for allegedly having orchestrated murder during his time as president, which rather illustrates my point. He had out-of-control thuggy underlings who were just the darlings of the CIA. I spoke to CIA officers covering Georgia and said, what do you like about the Interior Ministry, Merabishvili? Oh, no, he's not as bad as you Brits say he is. But you Brits was not the whole of Britain. It was just a couple of analysts who were rather alarmed, including me. But anyway, Georgia got sick of that, and they voted in a moderate opposition, Georgian Dream, they called themselves. As time's gone on, they have proven to be, well, their enemies would say that they are transparently the playthings of a rival oligarch called Bidzina Ivanishvili, who is the wealthiest man in Georgia by far, moved here from Georgia. He is from Russia, sorry, he's of Georgian ethnicity, doesn't participate in politics directly. He's very worried about being sanctioned by the West. He's closer to the Russian sphere because that's where he started doing business. And this party, Georgian Dream, which has a majority, that this is all to the embarrassment of the EU cheerleaders, it does keep getting a majority, and the elections are not fantastically corrupt here because of Saakashvili's improvements in transparency. They have said that enough is enough with the huge number of NGOs, particularly American-based, but also European-based. One of the governing party MPs, Nikolo Samkharadze, recently said in an interview, which I played a clip of on UK Column News, that they have one NGO in this country per 143 citizens. Just try to imagine how many NGOs that would be in a country the size of Britain. This is a country of allegedly 3.7 million people. Nearly half of them these days seem to live in Tbilisi unofficially. So, if you've got control of this city, behind me, I'm looking at here, sorry that you can't see the panoramic view, but you can on some of my other clips. That's it. You've got control of the country, and you can get control of the city if you get control of the youth through targeting them and giving them what's for the West is a relative pittance monthly salary so that they go out and do their activism. And the activism is media stuff. It's, push gender queerness, incite hatred of Russia and the church in social activism. This is all being funded via cutouts from Washington and Brussels. That's what the party's on about. The Prime Minister just yesterday announced a last-minute decision to make tomorrow, Friday, the 17th of May, a national day. It would be a holiday for civil servants for respect for the family. And, the cynics would say, oh, they would, wouldn't they? What a Putin-like move. But you can see that they are, I think, genuinely concerned about the younger generation being lost to nihilism and hatred of everything that doesn't come out of Washington and Brussels. And they will brook no opposition. So they've been out on this main drag here behind me, Rustaveli Avenue, all week, sometimes getting into serious fracas with the police, but mainly just wrapping themselves in EU and Ukraine flags and making a big noise and saying, we demand, and I'm sorry about the cat fight, but that's a bit of local colour in the background there, just demanding that everything change to bend to their will. But they're a clear minority of Georgian society, even among the population of Tbilisi, the capital. I don't think most people, having spoken to lots of people in the last couple of weeks, are of that mindset.
And the reporting of it from the MSM, the legacy media in the UK, that's hundreds of thousands of people. But you're actually claiming you're there, and you're saying it's more like 10,000 people.
Well, the whole of Rustaveli Avenue from end to end would barely hold 100,000. Yeah. And they did come out at times, I remember, the November 2003 revolution, the November 2007 first protest against Saakashvili, the moment when Ivanishvili broke with him, because he would claim, I think he was starting to see that Saakashvili was an autocrat at that point. Then you really got people, and that was at a time of year with pretty cruddy weather as well. Now, despite the cold and wet snap, it is May, and so people are prepared to stay out most of the night, and you just do not see the avenue full. It's tens of thousands, and yet statements from US senators and others have been talking about hundreds of thousands of Georgians. Of course, if they're talking about the entire payroll of their NGOs as being people on their side, then yes. But then you've got a quarter of the population, and then we're in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got characters like Tobias Ellwood, 77th Brigadier disinformation officer, coming out and reporting on things that we're going to touch on in a minute is the assassination attempt of the Slovakian president was perhaps a red flag by Russia. I mean, these people don't have an off switch. They will say anything that's written down in front of them and read it out. I mean, what are your thoughts on people like Tobias Ellwood?
If you look at ukcolumn.org and go to the search bar and type in Ellwood, for those who don't know, it's ELLWOOD, you will find a very useful article or two by Philip Ridley on the unconstitutionality of Ellwood's position, because until recently he was chairing the Defence Select Committee in Parliament at the same time as being a serving officer with the army. Anyone who knows anything about the Glorious Revolution, 1688 to 1690, the Bill of Rights, and yes, we do have one. It's not just the Americans. We're told we don't. And you may know from having been down under that the Australian High Court very recently, during the COVID tyranny, ruled that Australians do not enjoy the protections of the Bill of Rights, but it is a British constitutional document of prime importance. That Bill of Rights insisted that you couldn't have standing armies, and more particularly, you couldn't have anyone outside Parliament dictating or menacing the terms of free debate in Parliament. Now, if you've got men, and during the second and between both world wars, actually there were hundreds of them in Parliament, something like 20% of the MPs. If you've got men in Parliament who are, well, Penny Mordaunt would be a woman these days, who's an example as well, who are saying in their often vulgar ways, "I am so proud to be a military officer, and I'm also in Parliament," they're obliged to take orders from their chain of command. Right? How can they be loyal to their constituents? And you've stood for Parliament, you know what the issue is here. But many people lose sight of that and think that our MPs are just the government. No, they are there as a counterbalance to the government. They're there to scrutinise the government. And Ellwood is perhaps the most egregious example of how that is disregarded.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the 1688-89 Bill of Rights, because we've had to bring this out to the fore during the ULEZ campaign. I'm not going to get too far off track, but many people have gone through the courts armed with the Bill of Rights, and they know that you have to go through the courts and be tried and convicted before you pay a fine or a charge. But they don't know that this is actually something that they can hold within their arsenal as a pushback to the tyranny that's going on. Yes,
this is something, I mean, we often get criticised, don't we, for encouraging people to be free men on the land and such terms. You know, not a term we've ever used except to criticise the poor understanding that goes into the term. But about the time UK Column was getting going 10 years or more ago, there was a flurry of interest, particularly, as I remember, around Glasgow, actually, that you had a number of other groups that called themselves similar things like Scottish Sovereigns, and they were all making lazy shorthand allusions to the same point. You know, I don't have to register my vehicle, I don't have to pay any tax, etc. And that gave the whole of the wider movement a bad name that was reviving constitutional interest at the time. But the core understanding that a jury has to try you, that your peers have to convict you, is safeguarded. Of course, somewhat differently in Scotland than in England, and we see it being attacked in different ways in Scotland, with the reduction of the Scots jury from 15 to 12, and the somewhat bogged down now, thankfully, the attempts to remove Scots juries from increasing areas of criminal law. But there's a reason why the enemy in charge wants to remove jury trials. You know, they are a real safeguard.
Absolutely, and it's funny, the foreign plates, that we see plenty of vehicles driving around where we live, Alex, and they have Ukrainian plates. So they're so desperate that they're bringing across very large 4x4 diesel vehicles as well, which I'm sure keeps the Green Lobby very happy that these people are driving around en masse. But before we get on to the Ukrainians, can I just get your thoughts, please, on the assassination attempt of the Slovakian Prime Minister? Now, this happened just yesterday, where Robert Fico was shot several times. That there are reports 3 to 4. It looks like he's going to recover, but he's not out of the woods yet, as the line goes. What are your impressions of this initially, and who do you think is behind this attack?
I put some of this just today on my Telegram channel, which is called Eastern Approaches, or t.me/eastapp. You'll find it there if you're listening quite soon after this is uploaded today, Thursday, the 16th of May. the most striking data point is that Fico himself, just a month ago, said, and I have linked to it in my Telegram channel with the right timestamp, but it is in Slovak, I've given a gist of the translation, said, quote, "Things are now so desperately tense between me and the opposition that I wouldn't be surprised if a government minister was shot, and I am not exaggerating 1 millimeter." He's known, including by Andrew Bridgen, who has put this out correctly in the aftermath of the assassination attempt, he's known to have gone further than other heads of government in saying that his country is not only not minded to sign the WHO pandemic treaty and international health regulations, but also that they're constitutionally prohibited from doing so. And of course, the WHO, WEF, and such outfits like constitutions to be disregarded to the extent that you just get the head of government or head of state to sign things away. And we always at UK Column say, think constitutionally, that's the executive. It can't bind its national parliament and national courts without them ratifying it and transposing it. So the Slovaks, having gone through communist tyranny, have in the form of Mr. Fico, their longest serving prime minister ever, who always gets the blame for, together with Viktor Orban in Hungary, holding up what would otherwise be a united bloc sanctioning Russia and Russian energy and whatnot. Fico has said, look, if you want any such things to go through the Slovak parliament and government, they're going to need the Constitutional Council to ratify them. And this is what really riles the WHO. There's plenty of means, of reasons, I think, why people would want him gone. And I think we're past the point of, writing such things off as complete kooky conspiracy theory when you see how many African heads of state and government and Caribbean as well were removed from the scene in the first year of Covidianism. So Fico, he had the trifecta. He had the opposition to medical martial law or health tyranny. He had the even-handedness with regard to Russian relations. He shared Viktor Orban's desire or determination that he would only send aid to Ukraine, not weapons. And he's a stickler for constitutionality, something that the European Union itself is very aggressively going for in institutions. With, being an interpreter working in Brussels, I see more of this now that the new blasphemy in the EU is not any kind of sexual or racial touchstones of the New World Order. The new blasphemy is suggesting that the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament do not have untrammeled sovereignty, that they don't have direct ability to rule as if there were no national governments in the member states. That if you stand in the way of that, that's what gets you crushed now. So I have no idea particularly who would have pulled the trigger. Of course, overnight, the attempted assassin is increasingly said in Western media to have been a member of a group that was some kind of pro-Russian radical group. But weren't we hearing until yesterday that Mr. Fico was the pro-Russian radical? Yeah, it's incredible. It's like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It's like President Putin's been dying of cancer. He's got dementia, Parkinson's, leukemia. He bombed himself as well, Alex. I don't know if he fired a missile on himself, and now he's trying to kill his allies. I mean, people must think that these malcontents like Tobias Ellwood must think that the British public are very, very stupid indeed. That actually has come out in some of the whistleblowers' reports of what went on in 77th Brigade and other outfits, 13 Signals Regiment and a whole bunch of Foreign Office spin-offs that UK Column often puts on a graphic that we show on screen. The slide is busier and busier with all of these disinformation management outfits in Whitehall. The assumption many of them share, particularly the best known, at least 77th Brigade, is that the plebs are utter thickos and that they have the attention span of a goldfish. And it's not just us in the free media saying that now, Marcus. That is something which whistleblowers have come out and said to legacy media titles, that particularly during the ramp-up of COVID, they were raw recruits. They weren't all complete newbies to the army, but they were more or less plucked out of previous duties, given very little training in what was lawful for the military to do, or what was lawful in terms of intelligence generally, what kind of collection and retention of data and filtering and scanning and blackening of people's reputations is allowable domestically. Hint, very little indeed, and all need warrants from a Secretary of State. They were given none of that. They were just told, well, monitor the plebs for signs of discontent and go after them with a pickaxe, verbally speaking, if you see any discontent.
Yeah, I mean,
that's normalized the idea of trolling and flaming anyone. And of course, they kept tabs on some pretty senior people, and they were themselves were stupid enough, not to realize that the likes of Peter Hitchens, and it's happened on several European countries as well, that in the end they would do a subject access request or the equivalent in other countries like the Netherlands that I know well, and whack the government with that, and then get an admission that yes, your name was on a blacklist of undesirable people who tell too much truth while staying within the law, who must be maligned at every opportunity.
Yeah, well, we're seeing this in Australia, Canada. I mean, in Australia, they're asking for Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, is asking for Elon Musk to be arrested. You couldn't make this up.
Yes, I saw that. It was a month ago, yeah.
Yeah, with Trudeau as well, what he did, the debanking scandal that we've seen in Canada with the truckers. Anyone that supported the truckers, their accounts were frozen. We've seen the debanking scandal going on in the UK, and Nigel Farage, like him or loathe him, he managed to expose a lot of the stuff, that deep state operations that were going on, and bring it out into the public domain. But getting back to the point about the stupidity or arrogance or ignorance, when you look at how many people, God bless them, as Christians, we must say this because we need these people healthy. We need them for this battle. God bless the ones that took 3 to 4 shots of COVID, Alex, and you still see them driving around with masks on their own in a car. I mean, what were your thoughts on that?
That is, I don't know what the correct psychological term is, but it's been suggested in layman's terms that it's a kind of Stockholm syndrome. I know that I'm misapplying that, but I'm not doing it in my own terms. I'm echoing what the inaccurate use of the term that I hear other people use, which is to have taken on the defeatist mentality that has been pushed at you. And we had some particularly thoughtful writers from different walks of life from various countries, Ireland, Australia, standouts, some European ones as well, write in with articles which you'll find in our COVID section, ukcolumn.org, and then go to topics and coronavirus and look through the history of it. Back in 2020, 2021, people were already saying, this is a mind attack. Dr. Bruce Scott in the Scottish Borders is one who's written a whole series on us for us called Menticide 101. You'll find if you search for that word on ukcolumn.org. And the wearing the masks in the car, you particularly saw it in Belgium, I have to say, on my travels. Not that I traveled that much during the lockdown, obviously, but Belgium was the kind of place that just went the straight out fascist route, thou shalt wear a mask everywhere. The Netherlands went for allegedly a more liberal policy. And then you see, interestingly, how people's heritage and constitution makes a difference. The Dutch are defiant. They were much more oppositional to the Nazis than other countries because they just not liked authority, particularly not authority that can't trace its legitimacy back from God and the king. So there was some variety, but right out to the far east of Europe, where I am now, and I've seen pretty much all of these countries now, their jab take-up rates were mercifully very low, like 1/6 of the population, probably because of the Eastern Orthodoxy and the positive effects of that. But even here, you got lots of babushkas thinking, well, for the rest of my life, I'll just put a mask on every time I go out because it's the safe thing to do.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. I mean, our impressions right away, and I've got this as a part of historical fact. When the BBC in 2020, I think it was around the 23rd of March 2020, when the BBC said this is dangerous and deadly, by elimination, I knew right away that this was nothing to worry about. And many people could see this coming with Event 201, which 6 months before, there was an event about this exact scenario. It was all role-played, it's all played out, and people have been talking about this for years. But I don't want to take you down that pathway, because we could be here forever and a day, but the links that you left, we'll definitely share them, because UK column throughout the whole of the COVID era were right above the target, and they're on the money, and we're calling it out like it is, and advising people of their human rights, and advising them that they didn't have to wear masks, they didn't need an excuse, they didn't need a doctor's letter, and there was nothing obligating them to take any of these vaccines.
That's it. And although it was very much a kind of anti-traditional safeguard, there was the Equality Act 2010.
Yes.
For those who weren't following politics or who've come from abroad, They might not remember that just before the Labour administration lost the election, Harriet Harman, who was, I think, the guiding force together with Peter Mandelson in the whole of that administration, I think they did more than Blair together. Harman legislated, she got through Parliament, obviously, something that was called socialism in one clause. And this was the duty on public bodies to safeguard equality, and brought in the notion of protected characteristics. And we have a whole corpus of literature on ukcolumn.org that will tell you why this is fundamentally repugnant to the Constitution, because it's even the title of one of our pieces written by Mike Robinson on the site. Human rights are not God-given. No, that's not the exact title, but we have a whole section on that. They are an opposition. They are fake rights, because the state giveth, the state taketh away. Blessed be the name of the state. That's the basis of human rights. And I was one of the first to see that, because GCHQ had this human rights framework of law imposed on it very early after the 1998, which was the beginning of the Blair administration, when the Human Rights Act came in. But anyway, the Equality Act of 2010, it took some while for our side to realise this, but pretty much uniquely in Britain, you wouldn't get robocops as you would in Australia, New Zealand, Germany, many parts of the US too, saying thou shalt wear a mask or we'll be dragging you out backwards. You were able in Britain, with slight differences between Scotland and England, but you were able anywhere, because of that legislation, to say, if you ask me why I'm not wearing a mask in your shop, you will be in breach of the Equality Act 2010.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll be able to come after you. That's criminal.
We used that.
Yeah.
We used that many times, and people who were briefed backed off straight away, because there was actually £5,000 fines that had been handed out for people that had the intelligence, the bravery, and the wherewithal to stand their ground and say, no, these are rights that are in perpetuity. They cannot be changed. They just cannot, although there's a coach and horses driven through them on a regular basis. But we'll maybe come on to that if we've got time. I just want your thoughts, please, Alex, on the meeting that's going on right now between the Russian President, His Excellency Vladimir Putin, and the President Xi of China. What are your thoughts, and what would it be to be a fly in the room for that event?
Well, they're both details men. Putin, I think most significantly, has just last week replaced Sergei Shoigu, his defense minister, with an economist, Andrei Belousov. And this implies, before we get onto the Chinese connection, which is crucial, this implies that Russia is in for the long haul in its war in Ukraine. And it implies that it is going to go after the West's economies. It's going to be a war of economic attrition. Yeah. That unlike the previous world wars, where the city and Manhattan and the neutral Dutch, in the case of the First World War, owned the patents and fleeced both sides and prolonged the war to make a killing in the financial sense. People who read Smedley Butler, War is a Racket, will know that, or many other such books. General Patton came to that conclusion too. Unlike that, this time, if there is a de facto World War III with the Russians, as Mr. Bridgen, I think, has said last week, they're already at war with, or we're already at war with them, and we just haven't been told yet.
Yeah.
The Russians do have a defense industry that is autarkic. It's a continental economy in the sense, like China and India. It doesn't need to import anything from other countries. The US is another example. So they can carry on and wage a war of economic attrition. There are some sectors like high-tech software, chips, even auditing, actually, where they do have Achilles' heels and where they're still dependent on Swiss, American, British, European sort of know-how, which could let them down if it's nobbled. But generally, Russia has gone to that autarkic route, and having an experienced economist at the helm of the defense ministry suggests that they will be going for the purchasing power of the dollar, sterling, the euro, as an extension of war, which would be, I'm not a military analyst in any sense, but I understand that's always been the Russian understanding of war, that it's much more an excrescence of diplomacy and flows also into the economic sphere than we're used to in the West, where the obsession is with kinetic and psychological operations. And then we get onto China. Well, they're uneasy bedfellows, as I often say, the Russians and the Chinese. There's a deep history of mutual suspicion, because these are two natural foes. They've wrestled long enough over where the border between their two empires should lie in the cold heart of Asia. The Mongols and many other peoples kind of straddle that fault line of power. but they have been forced into each other's arms. The Russian economy does require Chinese investment in particular, I think. But, you know, the Russian economy, as I understand it, and again, I'm not an economic guru, but it is vastly under-measured because GDP was invented in the 1930s, I think 1934, by a US Democrat, precisely to do this, to overcount the effect of government spending in the economy. You know, to assume that it was never going to be deleterious to the economy, only ever a positive factor. And it vastly underestimates the importance of raw materials and Russia's ability to take those raw materials and China's and overnight convert an ice cream factory. That's not quite the right example, but to convert a civilian factory into a tank factory, and run it day and night with pretty reliable production. So that's the level on which China and Russia have got it together. There remains the, I would say, somewhat justified fear Russians, and there are Russian Defense Ministry documents to this end, and even Chinese Defense Ministry ones that have leaked that suggest it. Early in the Third World War, when it really breaks out, the Chinese will do the dirty and, you know, attack Russia from, shall we say, the rear, from the east, because they'll be fighting, you know, mainly against the West in Europe or in the Pacific. But there may also be an undeclared or even declared point in the Third World War at which China turns on Russia. That at least is the fear in Russia, and I think somewhat like France, after the experience of being bopped by the Germans 3 times from 1870 onwards. They decided after that, well, it might be amoral of us, but we're just going to cling on to the underbelly of that juggernaut and unite ourselves with its heavy industry. So hence the coal and steel consortium that became community that became the EU. I think that's the basis on which the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Cooperation Organization have been set up, so that Russia can ensure to its as much satisfaction as it can muster that the Chinese won't do that, at least not too early on.
That's fascinating what you just said, and we regularly interview a legal expert or a legal advisor, Mr. Giovanni Di Stefano, who was an advisor to Milosevic in Serbia, and also Saddam Hussein, a fascinating character, a controversial character, of course, smeared and did serious time for winning several cases in the courts of appeal that he's admitted that he would never win now. Not with the deck stacked as it is. But it's interesting that your analysis of the Chinese relationship with the Russians, because they are jumping into bed together and they've been forced into bed together by these sanctions. When we look at the Russian economy, the sanctions have actually had the opposite effect. They've brought the Russians closer together with the Chinese, and the BRICS Alliance, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, I think South Africa is in there as well. There's also the Saudi Arabians. I think there's about 14 to 15 different powerful allies all queuing up to come in. And their GP is being driven by fossil fuels, something that in the West we're looking to absolutely shoot ourselves in the head, not the foot, the head. What are your thoughts into the BRICS Alliance, and where is this going to go?
It's the hottest topic, I think, in the free media, or one of the very hottest, because it draws in a lot of aficionados. I mean, I won't go down the health tangent again, but I would just mention on that front that we're starting to get thinkers. In fact, an Australian academic, Dr. Petra Buskens, wrote a comment piece for us, which went up just this week. If you could scroll down the front page of ukcolumn.org to the comment section, you will see the first of 3 articles of hers, or essays, retrospectively asking, what can we learn from the spat in our circles between the mass formation adherents, so the Belgian Professor de Smet and his opponents, Dr. Malone, you know, and that's the first time I think we have wanted to attract actual, you know, a ding-dong debate on this issue, rather than just try to concentrate on picking holes in the tyrant's armor. And likewise, we have deliberately not tried to get too controversial on this issue that dominates the economic debate within the dissident scene, which is, are the BRICS the saviors of mankind or the devil incarnate in a new garb? You know, and I don't like one-liners. For example, you know, Mr. Rockefeller set up the BRICS and such things. He may well have done. But Vanessa Beeley, who regularly contributes to us, and Mike Robinson, our joint founder and editor, regularly say that the key thing there is it's perfectly possible that an alliance was begun with nefarious aims, because the only game in town, the only brokerage facilities or what have you, the only market in which you could start something like this would be the city or one of its offshoots like Manhattan. But that does not tell us everything about the further course which is pursued by such an organization. I mean, the Western elites are always subverting and hollowing out our previously venerable institutions. And in the language of memes, they're killing the animal and wearing its skin as a suit to compel respectability. And that could be the case with BRICS, that it was thought of by the Rothschild Rockefeller high-ups as something which would bring the newly mature economies of the non-West, of the global South as well, into lockstep with the West, but that things went off reservation. That's perfectly possible. I particularly value Vanessa Beeley's point that she makes from time to time, that there's a, should we say, a critical mass in Russia and in China, but I think she knows Russia better and says more about Russia, and of course the Middle East, Iran. There's a critical mass of people there who have got themselves into mid-ranking to senior positions in the military and the economy and in culture and in government ministries, who have a genuine desire to be true to their nation's best traditions and to serve their own people and wider humanity without fear or favor. And many of these were schooled in Britain and America. And so it's cynically assumed that they're all placemen for the wrong people, because they must all have been nobbled like Saakashvili here in Georgia was, and so many others. But I think Vanessa is right to point out that people's deeper loyalties do win out. People do come to repentance. Using it for once in a non-Christian sense, because I'm not talking in most cases about Christians. But so I think that there is enough of a determination among the BRICS, or potentially there is, to make something better than the current economy. I would be willing to concede and to those who know 10 times as much as I do about finance in the economy on why I might be talking pie in the sky there. And I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of digitization of currencies. It's not my specialism, but just from what I've seen of the world and the cultural vectors in the world, I am not prepared to write off cynically the idea that the BRICS is a shot at having something viable that's better than dollarization. And particularly, as you mentioned, the transition away from fossil fuels. We very interestingly interviewed a young Kenyan farmer, Jasper Machogu. The first name is spelled Jusper. If you put that into ukcolumn.org, you'll find it. He proudly wears on his T-shirt when he does interviews the slogan, "Fossil Fuels for Africa."
Yeah.
And I'm actually here in Georgia at the moment with Charles Ortel, who's visiting from Manhattan, whom I've interviewed for UK Column, a Manhattan investor who has brought more of the Clinton dirt to light than anyone else, I think, on the planet. And he's a friend of Africa and a long-term visitor there, and absolutely of this mindset. I was discussing it with him the other night. The making dirty of the idea of what we're told are fossil fuels, I'm skeptical on whether they are or not. That is not really aimed at us. It's a luxury problem for us to debate in the West. Shall I buy an electric vehicle or not? That is to ensure that the rising billions, particularly in Africa, to a lesser extent Latin America and parts of Asia and the Caribbean, never get to the level where they can run as much electricity. You've got emerging economies like here in Georgia, where finally there's reliability and affordability, that there is something like a middle class that can have electronic apparatuses on all day and drive around reasonably predictably. Many other parts of the world, like Jasper Machogu's Kenya, outside the biggest cities at least, where, as he puts it, your fridge in a Western country consumes more electricity than my farm. His home and everything else on the farm has less of a voltage to it than an American's domestic fridge. And that obviously is in someone's interest to ensure that, because that energy is going to have to be taken from existing supplies. So that's what makes this area of the world, the Caucasus, so notable. is that these are small, weak countries pulled between the West, the East, the North, and South, but they are both source and transit countries for the energy and the consumer goods flowing from India and China and through Iran that the West and Russia desperately need to keep up their lifetime. That's what makes the Caucasus an area where everything's to play for.
Absolutely. And we're not saying we're waving a flag for BRICS, because remember, these are nations that still lock their people down like animals. China's almost the polar opposite to Russia when you're talking about theological differences. They're for late-term abortion. They have capital punishment. There's alleged mass genocide going on in the Uyghur regions. And so that's why the Russians don't sit comfortably, but they have a sort of like a treaty of non-aggression, if you like. And this is what we suspect. This is what our experts are telling us that is being signed right now, because Russia has no intentions of setting off nuclear weapons.
Well,
unless...
dare I say Molotov-Ribbentrop? I'm not suggesting moral equivalency, but analysts in this part of the world remember that pact rather more than we do. And I'm absolutely not suggesting that either Putin or Xi plays the role of a Hitler or a Stalin in there, but when you've got great land powers rubbing up against each other in Eurasia, that's what they do. They say, let's bury the hatchet, despite our people's mutual long-standing suspicion and our natural enmity for smaller nations and raw materials in this area. Yeah. Let's bury the hatchet until we've seen the Anglos off.
Indeed. Can I put it to you that the heads of the West, I say the heads, that Joe Biden is the head of nothing. He's not even the head of his own household. The man is purely elder abuse that we're seeing right now, if we're trying to be Christian about it. Rishi Sunak is a placement. We see the same with Macron. Most of them have come from the World Economic Forum Youth Development Program led by Klaus Schwab, which we might talk about just briefly. But do you see it like this? I'll put it to you that these people know exactly what they're doing by destroying their own economies. They've invested in the BRICS alliances and nations themselves. It's like insider trading. They know who's going to win. They know the results of the weather 2, 3, 4 months before it's actually happening. There's people that saying that they're controlling the weather through the HARP and operations like that. There are so many machinations going on in Machiavellian style degrees and levels that our own leadership is in on it. They're destroying their own economies, their own cultures by mass unlimited immigration, unfettered immigration. They're destroying the church and Christianity before our very eyes. We've seen such things as the Eurovision 2024, or even the painting of His Royal Majesty King Charles III. You've seen all these demonic entities and demonology being brought out before our very eyes, Alex. But do you think that the Western leadership are in on it and have their money tucked away, not only in gold, but in the BRICS alliances?
Yes, with the possible caveat there that I don't know whether they tuck their money away in BRICS currencies, but I wouldn't be surprised. In the ethno-nationalist scene, and more broadly now, it's become allowable to notice that we have a remarkable proportion, particularly in the British Isles, of people from the Indian subcontinent in particular, rising very high up in our politics. Where's their loyalty? I mean, Humza Yousaf has just been out on his ear in Butte House, and he said on a visit to Pakistan, "I'm a son of the soil." Yeah. His loyalty, and you hear the church bells tolling here, so and something you wouldn't hear back home so much. So yes, Brian Gerrish will be right with you on that, Marcus, because all of these oafs and buffoons never fail on one side of the line. They always fail on the side of the line which creates havoc and destruction. And they never do anything which just happens to be through bungling or whatever conducive to the continued existence and health of any of our institutions and our heritage. It's always destruction. So he always majors on it being deliberate, controlled destruction. There are many such sources that point in that way. From 150 years ago, from 50 years ago, however long back you want to go. One that particularly shines is, as you mentioned, Lord Cameron. Of course, he was Prime Minister before he was Foreign Secretary, with quite a gap in between. As Prime Minister, I'll put it the other way around, actually. It was Eric Pickles, a minister under him, who was feigning shock and outrage, or maybe genuinely outraged, but just not on the same page, when he discovered that the political charity Common Purpose was wrecking one British institution after another, putting mind bugs in, destroying loyalties and integrity. And Pickles said he had ordered, as local government minister, that municipal councils should have nothing to do with this organization. Pretty much at the same second, as Brian Gerrish recalls it, certainly very close in time, Cameron was on a great big junket to India, the famous one where he took a whole jumbo jet of people with him to press the flesh. And while there, he was selling common purpose like Billio to the Indians. This is the leadership network that you need to be getting involved in.
That's right. I mean, we call them the traitor class. We hashtag so many things traitor class because that's what they are. Let's not beat about the bush. And
the French have got, the French have got many good expressions for this that we don't have. And one of them is the title of a book, I think, by Raymond Aron, is Le Trahison des Clercs, the betrayal of the managerial class or the middle classes.
Absolutely. And only in 2022, MI5 and MI6, two lovely organizations, I'm sure you know very well, they changed the rules on the backgrounds. And it used to be formerly that you had to have at least one parent who was born in the United Kingdom for obvious reasons, because there is a proclivity of certain groups, shall we say, and cohorts, to betray their own, that will betray. It used to be the homosexuality. It used to be that we kept homosexuals out of the services because they were a higher propensity to betray. And we've just seen recently, there's the 1922 committee, the Mr. Ragg, who ushered in Rishi Sunak himself. He was caught, compromised, sending pictures of a sexual nature between him and youngsters. We've seen this throughout. I mean, Parliament, we have a great follower base. That's not, we don't have any fans, follower base. And they've sent us demographics on the percentage of MPs. The 10% identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual. I mean, and of society.
And that's before we get to Scottish politics. There was a time when 5 out of 6 Scottish party leaders were homosexual, wasn't there?
I mean, this surely can't be coincidence. Again, this is just a proclivity that certain groups have. Now, we're not saying anybody's right or wrong. We try to be balanced here, of course, on Herd Immunity News. But it does strike me as quite odd that there are 10% of our MPs openly gay, homosexual, bi, lesbian, whatever you know they class themselves as, and on societies it's 1 to 2%. Why is that?
I mean, the same correlation does not equal causation. Objections will be made in whatever I say here that would also be made if we got onto questions of anti-Semitism. Because you've always got the question of certain groups or certain characteristics of people correlating with being high achievers, having the money, the desire, the upbringing, the disposition required to pursue public life, right? So obviously there's not such a thing as a homosexual culture or religion. Sure. So that's rather makes the case more strongly than there is with, for example, people saying the Jews seem to rise because there is a legitimate background of an expectation to do your best in your education. But obviously homosexuals are a very varied bunch, but they have more disposable income. They, until very recently, did not have children. That is now being changed quite aggressively in some circles. They are in the bubble, and it's the vulnerability. It's not me inventing this. This is something that was as recently as 2001, when I was being talked to by a vetting officer, was openly admitted. We don't want unacknowledged proclivities. By that stage, they said, "We'll have you as if you are a homosexual," but we don't want unacknowledged proclivities because that's a hold. A vulnerability.
I mean, let's really put a big question to you now and a big point to you now, and I don't think you're going to pull any punches on this. With all these things that we're seeing right now, there's an agenda towards more children changing their genders and chemical castration. There's the mutilation being celebrated by companies like Costa Coffee, where they actually had an advert, Alex, I'm sure you saw it, of a woman or a youngster with her breast cut off, put on a coffee cup. But there seems to be a sort of depopulation program going on right now. Late-term abortions, not having children, sending women out to work. We've seen the lowering of sperm counts like never before. A lot of the adverse effects that people are suffering are from the jab, from the COVID-19 vaccine. are to do with reproductive functions. We've seen this with the nanoparticles, lipo nanoparticles, resting in the testicles, resting in the ovaries. You're seeing a dramatic rise in stillbirth. Are you with those people that saying there's a depopulation agenda going on?
Yes. Any of the things you just said, Marcus, would be fodder for a deep expert, and I've spoken to deep experts in all of the things you just alluded to go on for all day to us about the 150-year backstory. But in all of those domains, there is a clearly enunciated agenda to halt and then reduce and then selectively thin out as well for certain characteristics of obedience and whatever and midwittery the population. There's no beating about the bush there. I mean, these themes were inserted into our science fiction and our wider cultural awareness as well from the late Victorian era onwards by the same chaps who've from the same bloodlines who've been in control of the British Crown for centuries prior. One, H.G. Wells even called it an open conspiracy. It's not subtle.
No, and we've been warned and forewarned by many people, even like Ian Fleming, when he wrote about Spectre. Many people say the Spectre of Light. Now, obviously, we'll be called mad conspiracy theorists, but it's amazing how many of these conspiracies actually come right from the writers like George Orwell, all old Etonians, Huxley.
And it's particularly striking being on a visit to Georgia because if you look at a Europe-wide map of survey findings or just statistics, I mean, the big shockers, and you'll be as horrified as I am by this, Scotland is doing even worse than the rest of the UK in this regard. The big shocker is the fertility rate per woman, where Scotland was down to 1.4. Not the worst in Europe. There are 1.1 countries now, like Poland, but the most of the West and most of Western and Northern Europe are well below replacement rate of 2.1. But in the bottom corner of the map in Georgia, you see a rare example of a non-Muslim country which is above replacement rate. And that in itself is probably well known to people, but I mention it in concert with another, more of a survey result map that I saw recently, which answered the question, do you agree with the statement, it is necessary or desirable to have children if you can, in order to do your duty to, whether it was phased as society or your ancestors, I don't know. 80% of Georgians said yes, and unsurprisingly, the British, the Irish, the Dutch are right down the other end of the scale now. They've been thoroughly mind-warped on that. What I mean to say by that is that Eastern Orthodoxy, the Russian, the Chinese cultural sphere, and I say that deliberately because of the one-child policy being so flagrantly against Chinese history, but that goes into their unusual primogeniture. That's a different story because they're a completely different civilization. But so we just say Eastern Christendom and Islam, they've always had this understanding that it is your duty, if you can, to have children and to expect that the Lord will provide for them. And, that's not to say that they all need luxury stuff and super duper educations. Otherwise, you shouldn't have them / abort them. Yeah. That's that thinking. And just by mentioning this, I know we can all think of people around us in the West who would roll their eyes or say, it's irresponsible. Hello, don't you know what causes having children? Time to tie the tubes, etc. That thinking was disgusting to everyone on the planet until very recently. And so, so you've been asking about West and East through this interview. It seems to be a particularly Western elite agenda.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's own father is quite open about the dramatic decrease in population that he'd like to see. He didn't tell anybody how he was going to go about it, Alex. He'd like to see, he said on GB News interview, he'd like to see the population down to 12 million. There are many people that put forward the Albert Pike number that always comes up of 500,000. This is the ideal number of people that the elites, or whatever you want to call them, the traitor class, would like to see.
No longer standing in the other Georgia, the Georgia USA, which had the guidestones, which are no longer standing there, alas and alack.
Well, alas and alack indeed. But a couple of more big points before we let you go, and you've been amazing with your time, which we so appreciate. On the replacement program that we're talking about here, we've seen the demographics of the whole of the West being replaced, whether it be from Africa, the Middle East, other regions in the world. many people are concerned that there's a UN-backed fighting army, fighting force being placed, certainly in the UK where we are right now. What are your thoughts on those assertions?
I haven't seen solid backup for them. You're always having to filter claims which are based on inference, and I'm not going to poo-poo them if people are using their common sense. One of the strongest mistakes we make in the post-Enlightenment West is we've sawn off, you could say, one of the two legs of knowledge, or if you're a believer and also believe in revelation from above, you could say two of the three legs of knowledge, because there's revelation if you accept it, there's intuition or deduction, and there is empirical or induction, which is observing what happens, as a data feed. Science has now reached the point in its contortions that it's only accepting I observe. I want peer-reviewed data, and not using what the whole of Western and Eastern science has always understood to be the equally important, if not more important, source of knowledge, which is my mind is the ultimate tool. What makes sense to my mind? And that's why famously people with less formal education or less postmodern education are better at common sense and keep themselves out of trouble a lot better than overeducated idiots. Right. So I say that as a preface to this, because I'm not going to disregard the videos that we get sent to us from salt of the earth people around Britain and other Western countries that say, look at all these immigrants, they must be preparing for something, and making simple but by no means facile common sense observations like, you know what, if a bunch of men come without their wives, it's because they're coming to conquer, not to settle. Fair enough, I accept all that. Having said that, I have only seen one potential piece of footage. I believe it was from the West Midlands last summer, where it was a subcontinental man, maybe Pakistani, of about 40, stood somewhat defiantly with arms crossed because he was being asked in the garden of a block of flats by one of these salt of the earth types, what are you here for, mate? And instead of sulking off or I call police, he decided to give a semi-civil response. And of course, it could have been a put-on of the type that subcontinentals excel in. He could have been LARPing, as they say these days. But what he said was, well, actually, sir, if you want to know the truth, we have an agreement with your government. Right? And the way he fronted up to him and came out with that patter, even if he was a practiced Pakistani who's good at that kind of thing, made me think, might be something in this, Might be something in this.
But it's, the services, looking at MI5 and MI6, there's a few rotten apples in the barrel. And that's not to beseech. And we don't want to use
the compromised sexual perverts. They're scum that float to the top. So they give the rest of their sort a bad name. But MI6 in particular has always had, in my understanding, a few rotten apples, mostly near the top, in a sea of extremely competent and good people.
Well, they've maybe got a tap on the shoulder at Oxford or Cambridge. I know you're a Cambridge graduate. These things do happen at those institutions in Scotland. St Andrews is quite popular as well, because they used to, in the old days, they would get people who would actually be loyal to Queen and country or King and country. They wanted people who were the right sort of chap, if you know what I'm saying. Nowadays, it seems like they're recruiting people who are very easily compromised, and they are quite willing to disregard national sovereignty. Is that the case?
Yeah, it absolutely is. GCHQ was one of the last holdouts because unlike, if memory serves, unlike even MI6, which is very selective, because if you get into MI6, your staff union, even from the time when you were a graduate entrant, is the FDA, the First Division Association, which otherwise is for senior Whitehall mandarins. A decision was taken that MI6 was such a superior service that all of them should be in that, right? I was just saying that by the by. But even MI6, SIS formerly, if I remember correctly, used back in my day, in the early 2000s when I entered, the general, what's the proper name for it? The General Civil Service exam. I haven't got the proper name, which I also sat. I flunked that, by the way. And my dad predicted, having sat it in the 1970s, that I would flunk it. He said, son, you're just going to be asked in 72 different ways in a couple of hours whether you would go against your conscience. And that's exactly what the exam was. Yeah, but GCHQ uniquely had its own entrance exams. Are you actually good at maths or language? Right. If so, we want you. Otherwise, we're not interested in yes men. I don't know how far that's been rescinded now. But yes, the vulnerability the biddability is there. You know, John Waters, the finest Irish commentator, I think, of our time,
Yeah.
talks about this with particular reference to Ireland, but it's certainly true of Scotland as well. That you know, the political class know that they're doing the bidding of corporations, of banks, of hedge funds, of think tanks. Basically the private, you know, 0.01% wealth of the West. And therefore you don't want people to think, you want people to implement managerialists. The Church of England is run by that policy. It's almost by the by that 24 women have become bishops lately. That's almost the least far-reaching change. What's more important is that what kind of women / in some cases men these suddenly promoted bishops are. They're managerialists. They used to be running the NHS or the BBC.
Sure. And people have seen this straight across the board with the immigration. They've seen it with the Home Office, the complete apathy. It's not apathy, it's not competence. These are planned measures and operations that are going on to bring as many people here into the UK as possible. They use the small boats crisis. That's a fraction. I think it's something like 7% of our net migration comes from these boats, whereas the real worry and what is leading to deaths, this is leading to the excess deaths that we see in this country, because the new arrivals, they're taking up hospital places, they're taking up dental places, they're given priority, accommodation, primary school places, high school places, you name it. So the more people that come into a fractured, broken economy, the more Brits or indigenous people, if you want to call them, that are going to die. So these people have absolutely no consideration for what we would formally say their own.
Yeah, and in fact, if you look at Cornwall, it's probably the first example, at least in England, of the county where the natives have been pushed out completely. And that's happened, I think that the last push has happened just in the last year with the house prices, and it's got to, you know, beyond absurd levels. But I mention that because it's not an example of immigrants of different skin colour. It is that, you could say it's a knock-on effect, but the Grockles, the wealthy native British from elsewhere, have come in and pushed out the Cornish completely. But then, you know, as with the question of grooming gangs, where the Punjabis and the Sylhetis seem to take the rap for a much bigger problem of people high up in the councils, white British, abusing and allowing the abuse of children. You know? Likewise here, because Cornwall Council, which isn't run by a bunch of Pakistanis, it is an aggressively unified and horribly managerialist council with very many sins and faults, but it's still Cornish, or at least ethnically British people in it. It has said, oh no, we're not going to build any more houses. They're not even making maximum use of the leeway they have within the ridiculously tight confines of British planning law, which was the first and most draconian in the world. No, they don't want to do that, because there are enough stakeholders in the county that would be angry with them because they would lose value on their houses. So within Cornwall, you can see as a microcosm, it's not a case of Johnny Immigrant driving us out. You could say that it is a corollary of what's happening on a national scale, where Johnny Immigrant has pushed out even the wealthy people from the home county, so they go to Cornwall and the Cornish get pushed out. I mean, I saw that in Cheltenham too, with everyone having been priced out of the Cotswold villages when they became popular in the 60s and 70s. By the time I got there just after 2000, they'd all been piled into sink estates on the edge of Cheltenham and Gloucester, because the villages were now, you know, owned by the beautiful people.
Yeah, you should see this right across the board in every part of the UK, except for where the elected officials live, or the civil service. You know, these are almost ring-fenced off, and it's very unlikely that you're ever going to see anyone in Belgravia. You know, in London, you're not going to see people going into the certain parts of the Cotswolds as well, and in the southwest, those beautiful areas. I mean, Plymouth, I don't know what's happening in Plymouth, but I don't think it's that good. From the people that we know there, poor old Plymouth, the home of excellent UK column. You're exposed to all these NGOs that you're talking about that we need to get rid of, whether it be the World Health Organization, whether it be the World Economic Forum, the IPCC. All of these non-governmental are governmental organizations, and they all hate Christianity. And the idea of the family is, like, quickly, I mean, demonology, right? We've just seen the Eurovision Song Contest. To take you onto this, I don't like to do it. I'll throw some holy water in a minute, try and get rid of the spirits. But when you see basically a demonic prayer and ritual on the stage of a European festival of music, it's hard to ignore that these people are now taunting us.
Yes, I mean, at the most basic level, the Lithuanian entrant knows that he's going to get votes by singing "I'm Your Messiah." The Irish entrant knows that she's going to get votes by saying in a press conference, screaming at the top of her lungs, "I'm queer, I'm a witch." And you could say it's, it's seeking publicity, it's being a drama queen for the sake of it, but they know that that's where the interest is.
Yeah,
so,
and
yeah.
They're outside Holyrood boasting about abortions, late-term abortions. I stood in the 2019 general election for the Brexit Party, as I was saying before, and the Green candidate and I clashed completely because I said, none of your policies are to do with the environment. They're all about abortion rights and late-term abortions.
Yeah, just as you might have taunted the SNP by saying, where's your independence agenda? And that, of course, has led to the split in the SNP. First Alba and then, other splits within what's remained the SNP for this very question. Are we actually about independence? And the Greens in Scotland and Ireland in particular, I think, are now pretty much coming out and saying it openly. Actually, we're not about the environment.
No, not at all. I mean, the legislations they're standing for, they were gutted that the hate crime looks to be going nowhere because it's unenforceable, it's unpoliceable. The police have just put up their hands and said this is impossible. But really, we can't not have you on this platform and ask you about Donald Trump, because so much is contingent on him. What your thoughts are on him, the outcome of the election, if he's given a fair go. What do you think is going to happen, and what are your overviews and impressions of Donald Trump?
Well, I don't think he's ever going to be allowed to win the election. I think it's, the state of Georgia, again, not the one I'm in here, the Republic of Georgia, but the state of Georgia is a particular focus of our US correspondent, Mark Anderson. And there's an organization called voterga.org, which has chapter and verse on just how badly that election was thrown. And if you type in Georgia or Mark Anderson into ukcolumn.org, you will find that interview with voterga.org as well. That is but one of several swing states dotted around the US that have such horror stories to tell. That's but it used to be a major focus here in the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Look for ways, because we were all pretending to be goody two-shoes back in the early 2000s. We were supposed to be looking for ways in which the vote could be thrown, so that the organs of democracy and decency in Strasbourg and Brussels and so on could wrap the Georgians over the knuckles, or the Azerbaijanis. And we saw all of those levels, such as the votes miscounted in the local ballot station, activists then taking them off and keeping them in a lockup overnight, postal votes or mail-in votes. What happens at central tallying stage? Stalin was a Georgian, and his famous line was, "It matters not who votes, it matters who counts the votes."
Yeah.
And all of this has come home big time to America. It's but even if you get rid of the electronic voting, there are so many ways to swing the election that way. And then we've gone beyond that. And again, this American model has been expatriated now to countries like Georgia, here, Tbilisi, that you get the young people saying, "Oh, we can't be bothered to wait 5 months to vote out this government. We know that's going to be a thrown election, so we're going to storm Parliament now."
Yeah.
Right?
So you don't think President Trump's going to get a fair run?
No, I don't. He is a person, since you asked, and I don't want to wriggle off the hook,
Sure.
A vain man, in some ways a somewhat deluded man, but no, I'll be completely frank about it. As we've said through this interview, I'm a committed Christian.
Yes.
This shocks Christians when I say it, but I don't mind. If you see a man who is enthusiastically a red-blooded heterosexual male, you should breathe a sigh of relief. Now, I'm deliberately going for the jugular of what's called Big Eva here. As Eva as in EVA, the neo evangelical elite based in the US and Britain. They're always saying, we must have complete wallies and dipsticks as our servant men, servant leadership men in society, in church and state. So we will look the other way when there's allegations of demonic Satanist ritual abuse by the whole of the rest of the political class. And when we see one guy who is nominally conservative, who may have put his hands down some lady's pants once, "Oh, we can't possibly vote for that. Oh, no. Right? Paul and other apostles in the New Testament are quite clear about this. You want men who've got strength and robustness. And in these very corrupt days, you should breathe a sigh of relief if you see that the man proves that he is engaged in his affairs with adult heterosexual willing females. Right, that shows that he's not corruptible in the way. Although of course the corruption used to be based on affairs with just that category of person, because anything more scandalous was unthinkable. But the whole of the rest of the political class has got, including Trump's opponents, past and present, have got a whole litany of accusations of doing nefarious things with the underage, and that's we could get even more bizarre than that.
Alex has a whole plethora of film footage of Joe Biden. Now, and what he's doing with these
just this week, the legacy media, it came out 2 or 3 years ago in our circles, but just this week, the legacy media, I think MSN or MSNBC, one of the two, decided, because obviously the DNC has put out word that Biden has to be politically decapitated before November. It's now officially allowed to report in these channels that 2 or 3 years ago, Biden's daughter, when petitioning a judge not to publicize her diary, said, "This diary in which I say that my father Joe Biden forced me to shower with him and made me feel very dirty in various ways." She said this is a genuine diary. But there's no longer a ban on mentioning that, but only because it's been decided that another contender for that Democratic nomination should get the upper hand.
Indeed, the hypocrisy is off the scale. When you see news that a lot of our viewers and listeners watch on Herd Immunity News, they watch GB News, they watch Talk TV. None of this is mentioned on these platforms that are meant to be so-called alternative platforms. But you'll see Tobias Ellwood regularly popping up with his views. So, I mean, in a nutshell, there is a lot going on right now. There's a war between good and evil. I don't want to be glib or contrite by saying it is like that, but you recognize that as a Christian man. What hope and solutions do you have out there? Just to round off for our viewers and listeners, what hope and solutions can you offer people in their daily lives?
The key is there at the end, daily lives. You start small. There are many faults that he's alleged to have, but Jordan Peterson has gained a great following by saying clean your room. And he's using that as shorthand for do what you can in your own household. So if Brian Gerrish was here, I think he would be saying, and I very much endorse it, well, stand for election in your parish council. Most Western countries have an equivalent outside England as well, but people say, oh, come off it. But no, party politics hasn't penetrated down to that level. You can get a lot done at that level. Take a leaf out of the Americans' books and stand for election for your school board. And there are many ways in which you can locally ensure that much of what we've been deploring is of little or no significance. And I'll give you, as you're a Scot, the classic example, which is the Western Isles, previously known as the Outer Hebrides, and to a lesser extent the Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland. It's maybe on its last legs now because the SNP is trying to nobble the local councillors in each of those 3 council areas one by one. But you've got 3 out of 32 Scottish council areas there, where, in political jargon terms, to this day, the council is ruled by knock, no overall control. The vast majority of councillors in Kirkwall, Lerwick and Stornoway are independents, simply because they have got that much mistrust of Holyrood politics, let alone Westminster, and because they have got a very strong tradition either of homesteading because of the crofting or of the Christian background in the case of the Western Isles. And so to this day, they will elect a man, and it usually is a man, on his name. Right? So it can be done if the population is prepared to vote for such a character. And that's not just abstract, because this means in practice that, and there are lesser examples like Pembrokeshire in West Wales, but the classic one is the Western Isles. When Holyrood, as a government or as a ministry or as a parliament, says, we're all going to read this sodomite textbook to our 4-year-olds, the Western Isles says, no, we're not. No, we're not. It's not suitable. And then you suddenly discover that the school boards and the councils have the ultimate say. And they've got the right people on them there to say no. No, but the other 99% of the United Kingdom and of the Western world does not have enough gumption to do that. So it can be done. It just takes, and we're talking small populations here. The whole of the Western Isles is 20 to 30,000 people, isn't it? So it can be done.
Hallelujah to all of that and amen to all of that. And I think that's what you're seeing as a rise in the independent candidate. We've interviewed Godfrey Bloom, the former MEP for the UKIP, and he's done with the party system. He, like yourself, he sees the corruption, and he's seen it for many years. He's been in the belly of the beast over in Brussels, the home of paedophilia throughout Europe, although it's increasing everywhere and it's not spoken about. But there is hope and there is light at the end of the tunnel. Before we sign off and say goodbye, and it's been a tour de force, by the way. I mean, I'm a massive fan of yours and the UK column, and I have been for many years, and I'll say it unashamedly. And I may as well, because you guys do an incredible job, and you've got hundreds of thousands of people, millions of views throughout all the work you've done over the past 10 years, you individually and your great colleagues. But is there anything you'd like to say in the last minute or two to our viewers and listeners?
I would be very remiss if I didn't say that if people appreciate what we've been saying, they should seriously consider subscribing financially and paying for it. We are more generous than most media outlets in providing a lot free, and we're increasingly aware that a lot of people will not cross the bridge of spending a £5 a month on a subscription to us. And some get shirty and say, the truth is free, as if we didn't need to keep out to covering our costs. But we do. We are, in bottlenecks in all of our production, written, video, podcast, because the time isn't available, because the time requires people's livelihoods. And so subscribe and get involved with the community. It's better for your psychology as well if you're involved with like-minded people in our forums, or not just UK Column, but any of the alternative and free media organizations that you favor. If you are a paying member of them, you are enabling more of their work, you're allowing them to grow, and you'll then be able, in whatever format the channel in question allows, to talk to like-minded people and associate with those who have your interests, those who live local to you, so that if the internet goes down, you're still in touch with them. And so that's what I would say, to get out of that halfway house of doom scrolling and thinking, oh, well, that UK Column or whoever it is, they have a few useful things to say, and then going back to moping.
Well, wise words indeed. And we will leave all the links on this interview on our platforms to get onto UK Column. And people have got the money. It's not a lot that's really required, the £5 a month. People can have a think about that. And if they want to get involved, they may well see it as a great investment, because it opens up so many other avenues to them and their families. But all that remains for me to say is thank you very much, Alex, for appearing on Herd Immunity News. And we hope to see you again in the future, and safe journey back to the UK as and when.
Thank you, Marcus. God bless.